Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character, Commitment, and Community. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative at Duke University, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics, the institutional home for this initiative and series. Before we begin, a brief note on logistics. As with everything Zoomified, there are often challenges that are unexpected. Please know that we have several folks working behind the scenes to swiftly jump in and address them. So just hang tight if that happens. Second, today's conversation will be in two parts. The presenter for today will present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A mechanism, and they'll be directed to me through the chat to ask of today's conversation partner. And with that, I am truly delighted to introduce and welcome James Arthur on how does the Jubilee Centre contextualize character virtues. James Arthur is the director of the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. He is also chair of the Society for Educational Studies and was head of the School of Education from 2010 to 2015 and deputy pro-vice chancellor from 2015 to 2019. He was previously editor of the British Journal of Educational Studies for 10 years and holds numerous honorary titles, including honorary professor of the University of Glasgow and honorary research fellow in the University of Oxford. In 2018, James was made Officer of the British Empire by the Queen herself. He has written widely on the relationship between theory and practice in education, particularly the links between character, virtues, citizenship, religion, and education. He established the Jubilee Centre in 2012, and the center has grown in size, scope, and impact since its launch at the House of Lords that year. So welcome, James. We're truly delighted to have you here with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to you for about 30 minutes to present your paper, if you will.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for that generous introduction, and welcome everyone. I've been asked to give an explanation really of the Jubilee Centre's reasons for existence, its context, and also perhaps some of its philosophy, and that's what I'm going to begin with. I want to tell a short story to begin with. A few years ago, I was at Roosevelt House in New York and gave a talk about the Jubilee Centre. And afterwards, a dean of a university that I shall not name asked a question and said, well, I do like some of the things you've said, but, you know, we Americans, you know, we're not really into this idea of virtue. Only Republicans are into virtue, which I thought was a strange thing to say, because when you look at the history of America, that's not the case. And I want to leave that as an idea in your mind as I go through this presentation that I'm going to make at the moment. Okay, so I hope you can see that. Now, the centre itself has far-reaching work which involves politicians, policymakers, business leaders, thought leaders, social entrepreneurs, community leaders, a whole gambit of people, and also it's international now as well, which we didn't expect to do at the beginning. So I want to provide some context for that. And I've got some models and definitions of character, which I've laid out in one of my recent books on the formation of character in education. And you can see some of them there. I'm not going to get into detail in any of these, just to say that some of them are very bad, based on eugenics. You can think of Nazi Germany and Japan, and you can think of progressive educationalists as well, who've got very clear ideas about this type of thing in terms of character. So character is quite a complex. It has a sort of a difficult history, and we're very conscious of that as well. But there are 5 lenses I want you to think about as I go through this presentation. First of all, character is sometimes seen as Christian education based on scripture and Christian theology. And that would be standard in America, as it was in the UK and most of Europe during this period, and of course, in Latin America and Africa and various other countries as well. Secondly, it could be seen as good education. So good education is good character education. Another one is seeing character education as direct instruction. That's an intervention in the curriculum. Actually providing a curriculum for character. Another one is to see it really in terms of positive psychology, seeing character as behavioral strategies, changing people's behavior, nudging them to do the right thing, counseling, classroom management, a whole range of social and emotional skills. It could be seen like that. And lastly, it can also be seen as community engagement. It can be seen as service learning, working in the community in some form. Now, in 19th century America, you've all heard probably of the McGuffey readers. They were very popular between 1836 and the 1960s. They're actually still being printed in America. I didn't realize that until I checked it. But this man, William McGuffey, produced these books, which was all about developing character and the virtues of young people. And it was extremely popular in America. And but after his death, the whole series began to become less Christian and began to change in some way. And I'll explain what happened there. In Britain, we had something similar. We had another Scot, Samuel Smiles, who produced this book, Self-Help. It was the first type of self-help book. It was extremely popular. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies, made him a millionaire in his day. But despite this, character remained very much a class concept. That's one of the problems in England, I would say, is that class was always the predominant consideration when it came to character. It was all about meeting the right people at an early stage, and so as they could get to know one another. It was a class concept, and that applied to business as well, and all the vocations and employment as well. But there was a real secularization of character. And here I wrote about this in History of Education. Simply, these Christians, most of them lost their faith, actually, and they wanted to replace character. They wanted to replace religious education in schools with character education. And there was a similar movement in the USA at the time as well. Our education system was built on this idea of public elementary schools being based on character. Character was always mentioned first, and this existed as a name of the education department in England, at least, from 1905 to 1949. So it existed for a very long time. In America, there was a real secularization process that began, and psychology also had a huge influence on that. You've probably heard of the Hugh Hartshorne and the Mark May studies in the nature of character. So secularization questioned its Christian foundations, while psychology questions its usefulness. Psychologists wanted to talk about personality and not character. So character in late 20th century, the USA really had a big start again with William Bennett, Secretary of State for Education under President Reagan in 1985. His main theme was that character education was good education, or good education did character education. He wasn't really involved in interventions or trying to change things. He just wanted every school to teach Latin and Greek and things like that. He was quite an elitist in some ways, and he wrote this book, Book of Virtues, which was published in 1993. And then we got President Clinton, came after him, and he made a number of speeches about character. Of course, this was the days when the Democrats and the Republicans spoke to each other, and Clinton was very much into this idea of virtue. He made numerous speeches talking about good character and about virtue. Clinton's Secretary of State provided grants for character education, and 38 states in America took up the money from federal grants, and they began to emphasize responsibility and respect. And institutions of society like schools, churches had to contribute to the building of character. Again, this was a time when the Democrats supported traditional marriage, moral responsibility, and a closer relationship between religion and government. Things have changed. And the White House conferences that Clinton began through his close association with Emmett Etzioni, who was at George Washington University, and his books, The Spirit of the Community, etc., had a huge influence. It was called the Third Way. So this was very much a political intervention, and the Democrats at this time were influenced by communitarianism. We don't hear much about that today. I attended the 1998 conference at the White House. It was at, well, not in the White House, it was in the Senate buildings near Capitol Hill. And I met Don Brownan, who gave me a copy of his book. And but he told me that all this discussion of character was not well informed, and it was riddled with historical, theological, and social scientific ignorance. And I took that on board very seriously. This conference was a multidisciplinary conference. We had theologians there, we had sociologists, we had political commentators, we had educationalists and philosophers. It was a very interesting conference, and he had nearly one of these every year during his time as president. And then we had President George Bush, and he decided that his wife would run these conferences, and so it became the First Lady's Conference on Character and Community, a continuation of the Clinton conferences. And whilst Bush talked about teaching character to our children as a high calling, only psychologists were invited to these conferences, and there was no talk of virtues, just values. So actually it was the exact opposite from that dean that spoke to me at Roosevelt House. So I had to explain to him this, and he didn't know about this, that, you know, the Republicans generally talked about values. They didn't really talk about virtues the way that he thought that they did. This led to some conservative criticism of character, and this is what lay behind their suspicion about ideas of virtue. So a lot of people from the Federalists, etc., this is a conservative newspaper, periodical, I believe, they thought it was psychological manipulation of children to push certain political agendas. There was also this communitarian influence, as I said, from Emmett Etzioni, and I wrote soon after I returned from those conferences in the States, I wrote this short book on the communitarian agenda in education. And these are the types of things that they said. And you can see that they thought the family was the primary moral educator of children, character education as a systematic teaching of virtues in schools, the ethos of the community is educative, and it goes on. There was 10 of them, but I've only given you 6 there. In England, the Labour government was very much influenced by communitarianism, and they began to promote character as well. So all these big character movements were promoted from the left, not the right. The right was suspicious of them. The left seemed to be comfortable with it, and they promoted them. And that goes back to the history of character, because if you go back to the Victorian times, it was the progressives, both in America and also in the UK, that were promoting these ideas of character. And I wrote, again, another book, Education with Character, in 2002, and that was the first book on character since the 1950s. So because psychology and psychology of education had a big impact on ideas of character, it tended to disappear. It tended to be about personality. The only place where it really stayed was in the private schools of England, where they really talked about character. And it was the Labour government that began to say that state schools should also build character, because that was very important for employment. So they linked it with the economy. So I wrote another article about the character and government policy, about how this idea of character was beginning to emerge in British education policy. I then, in 2011, as Dean of Education, proposed a school to the government. But when I proposed it, the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, for Education, said no. And he said no because he thought he was very suspicious. He thought I was going to be socially engineering young children. So it's quite interesting that this conservative background was also, criticism of character was also in Britain as well. So the origins of the Jubilee Centre, I'll just say this briefly. I met Arthur Swartz, who was the vice president of the Templeton Foundation, at a seminar I gave at Boston University in 2002. He invited me to put in a bid, which I did, for a grant. That was the first project from 2003 to 5. I then met Jack Templeton in London. I got another big grant, which was about 4 or 5 million. from 2006 to 2010. And then I became a member of the advisory board. I had a meeting with Jack Templeton the following day from that advisory board, 31st of September. And he asked me, would I be interested in a multi-million-dollar grant of about $35 million. So it was a huge grant. And he wanted this because he wanted to remember his father, who'd been knighted by the Queen 25 years before that. That's why it's called the Jubilee Centre. The word Jubilee comes from that. And also because it was the Queen's Diamond Jubilee as well. So we began to think about how are we going to do this. So we began to think about the building blocks of character. And you can see here 4 categories: intellectual, moral, civic, performance. We don't actually claim any originality for these categories, because the intellectual moral obviously is taken from Aristotle's ethics. The civic, you could go back to classical Rome, the Renaissance, the Scottish Enlightenment, and even communitarianism talked about the civic dimension. And the performance dimension of character, Thomas Lacona was writing about this in 2006. Today, the people best associated with these characters are there: Jason Beer for intellectual, the moral, Thomas Lacona, civic, Marvin Berkowitz, performance, Angela Duckworth, and her big thing about grit. But our framework, as I've just presented there, the 4 categories, is not simply about 4 categories. Our overall approach is holistic. We talk about virtue literacy, which is about understanding the virtues and how we come about to understand them. We break it down to the components of virtue literacy. We talk about phronesis in terms of wisdom, the approach to making wise decisions. So we think we've got a better coherent framework. And this framework has been used in many, many places. Our overall philosophy is one of neo-Aristotelian, which means that we use some of Aristotle's work to understand what we're about. This is our theoretical basis. So education, as we see here, is a process of formation involving the realization of certain potentialities that every child and individual has. So education is always part of a general movement towards the full actualization of the subject's nature. To formulate the goals of education, we need to determine how best these might be achieved, and one needs to have an account of what a human being is. So we adopt a teleological virtue theory approach. Virtue ethics has 3 main concepts: excellence, practical or moral wisdom, and obviously flourishing, which is the big thing that we emphasize here as well. And this theory holds to a 3-fold structure: who we are, who we could be, and how we get from A to point B. And that means that character then, therefore, if we want to transform our character, we have to aim at the right goal in life. We have to understand the steps to the next goal, and we have to habituate these steps. That is simply making them a matter of second nature. So school experiences in school can be the catalyst for the development of virtue. These experiences offer opportunities to practice good discernment and virtue. So throughout all of this, we have to have thoughtful attention to experience, and the practice of discernment tends to lead to good decisions and living well. Education primarily is an intellectual activity aimed at the formation of the intellect and a life of reason. It's about evidence, it's about thinking through ideas. So learning is a natural tendency in every human being, and all of us have the potential to learn. Learning is a process of self-activity, self-direction, self-realization of human beings' highest potentialities. So the purpose of education is to give an individual full possession of their past, to see, to dream, to imagine, to conceive, to judge, to reason, to feel, and to create. So education in this idea is the complete formation of a human person. And I'll finish really with this idea that education should aim to form people so they can live well in a world worth living in. The goals of human life is to develop its essential excellencies, the potentialities that define and constitute it. And all of this is coming from an Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian philosophy of education. And we found that this type of language has been very attractive to teachers and to others in the professions as well. And this is where we've had some real success. We've been producing reports on the professions as well. So this is one that we've just produced: character in the professions, how virtue informs practice. And this is available on our website. And so we write these reports about the police, about the army. We write them about doctors and teachers and lawyers and business people. And we have a whole series of these reports looking at the professions to see how they also can develop this virtue-orientated approach that neo-Aristotelianism promotes. I'm going to leave it there. I've said a lot in a short time,
So wonderful. Thank you so much for setting the table with that. What I'm hoping I can do is sort of prod a little bit more and then open it up for audience questions. So I'm particularly taken by the politics of this. And I think certainly here at the Institute, where we talk a lot about character, there is often a misperception that this is a conservatively derived emphasis in work. To what extent do you think that perception lingers in response, say in Britain, to the work you're currently doing? Is that an ongoing sense, or do you think that character is now sufficiently enough in sort of the interstices of politics not to be implicated by a conservative critique?
Okay, so 10 years ago, even though this had come from Labour, lots of those ideas had come from Labour. So as I said, people forget that many of these ideas had come from the progressive left, not the extreme left. The extreme left tends to be suspicious of most things. So this had come from the centre left, both the Democrats in America and also the Labour Party in Britain. The people who were suspicious of it were the Conservatives. So we had to, first of all, speak to the Conservatives and politicians and try to explain to them that this wasn't some left-wing plot to socially engineer children. But we also had to speak to the Labour Party when they lost office and the Conservatives were in office, to say that this wasn't a conservative agenda or a conservative view of character. We had to make it non-partisan, that it wasn't a partisan idea, that this was an educational idea that would stimulate discussion. So we never came up with a blueprint. We didn't tell people that this is what you must do. We said to people, this is a document, a framework for a discussion. This is a discussion document. It's not telling you what to do. And I think that's important. We didn't want to impose anything from people, on people. We wanted to have a discussion with them. And that's what we've done. We've spent a lot of time having discussions with teachers, with politicians, with business people. The crisis in the financial market in 2008, etc., and 2009, of course, created even more problems. And that meant that lots of businesses, etc., opened the door to us. So we never had any problem doing research in character virtues with the professions. So people were coming to us, asking us. So the police came to us and the army, we chose the army. Now we're doing the police. They had to wait 4 years before we got involved with the police. So lots of organizations have come to us and invited us to do research with them, to look at their workforce, to talk to them, etc. You know, so we've had some very strange requests as a result of that.
So I'd like your approach and movement of this into a nonpartisan space. I'm reflecting on a conversation I had about a year ago with a professor of education who, when having a conversation about character and virtue, said she was quite uncomfortable with it because the language of education is more focused on questions of justice and equity. And you recently wrote a piece where you addressed this question of justice. Is it your experience that the kind of work around character requires different disciplinary or professional work of translation to frame it in language and in terms that different professions appreciate or respect? Or has your experience been with the police or with educators that the language of character and virtue resonates? and there is in fact no pushback like I experienced.
Well, of course, I was the dean of a school of education, and I was in a school, a very large one, 200 members of staff, where we had lots of social justice warriors within the school, and they were often talking about sort of they wanted to improve the lot of the. I mean, you can't. Social justice is hugely important. What we have to do is we have to make sure that the social justice that people want is real, and that it can be implemented, and that we truly implement it. A lot of the people, if I was being personal, I'm saying a lot of the people that talked about social justice sent their children to private schools, and yet they were very keen about free meals for children who were poor in state schools. To me, it didn't make much sense in some of the things that they said. And we know that in the professions, things like being a doctor, if you want to become a doctor, 55% of our school of medicine at Birmingham University, which has hundreds upon hundreds of trainee doctors in it, thousands actually, 55% of them come from families where the parents are doctors or nurses, etc. They're in the health professions already. It's become quite incestuous. So social justice hasn't solved that problem, and that would apply to some other professions as well. So I think we have real problems on our hand that social justice hasn't actually taken place, because many of the people that proclaim the social justice have got the wrong ends in mind, because they themselves are not changing. So they have to change themselves. Character itself is also part of the social justice movement, that I argue, because if you give people opportunities to develop their potentiality, that is about social mobility. That's about giving people opportunities to become a doctor. What we have to do is empower people with character traits that help them in life, because everyone knows that when you go for an interview, what's been examined in the room is your character. That's the elephant in the room. It's never talked about. But the people interviewing you are asking, can I work with this person? Is this person congenial? Are they going to contribute? Can I trust this person? And these are character qualities, but you don't find them usually in a job specification. You might find them mentioned in a character reference, but you don't find it publicly discussed. And I think to give our children the opportunity to enter the professions, in a representative way, we need to build their character as well, which is what the left, the Labour Party in Britain, was talking about. And that's why we don't have so much problems of the language of virtue here that sometimes you do experience in America.
Yeah, and so would you say that in your experience in Britain, this language of character and virtue has in fact sort of more deeply penetrated public conversations or professional conversations than it would in the United States?
I'm not sure about, I do know that it's penetrated conversations here. Our inspectors of schools inspect character, and they do that not by metrics, but by professional judgment, by being in dialogue with the teachers of the school. So every school will have a vision statement, and most of these vision statements are mission statements, and most of them will contain virtue words. They'll talk about they want excellence, and they want their children to be the best version of themselves, or they want the children to be communicators, or the whole series of virtue words that they might use. And so the Ofsted, which is the inspection agency, are now asking those questions. How do you do that? How do you get your children to show dedication, build resilience, build all these other types of things? And these are important because employers want that type of thing now as well. They want a wise workforce. They want a workforce that can make decisions for themselves, the right decisions. They want to be able to trust them. Trust is a big virtue. They want an honest workforce as well. And so these are important words that children will pick up in school to begin with, and then take them with them into employment. The commitments that they make early in life will follow them through and will actually help them.
So the Jubilee Centre has a framework that incorporates different forms of virtue, whether it's moral virtue or performance virtue, civic virtue. Do you find that the public, right, educators in Britain, professions are more comfortable with performance virtues or the moral virtues, right? When you talk about resilience, certainly within the context of US education, resilience is a conversation everywhere, both in higher education and K-12. And right, that seems an easier conversation to have than a conversation about moral virtue, where I think there's still a perception that it's offering a judgment that maybe sort of the privileged can make, if you will.
Yeah, well, people always want to escape judgment, don't they? And yet they make judgments all the time. You know, it's rather ironic that they, you know, teachers say, I don't want to make any moral decisions or impose any morals on my children. I think they've got the wrong idea about morals, because they do it every day, whether they're conscious of it or not. They want, you know, they tell children to be honest with me. And children find that they won't be honest because the concept of loyalty, another virtue, is much more important to them. So they'll be loyal to their friends, which stops them from being honest. And we've seen this in the American army, in the British army, where loyalty supersedes any idea of honesty, and that causes problems. So teachers are involved in the moral dimensions. But as you approach schools, some schools will say, well, you know, we are more comfortable with, say, the civic virtues, you know, citizenship, you know, things like that, and service learning, and they think that's a good thing. But you see, all four of these things come together. They actually join together. And then they become a little bit surprised to find that justice is actually a moral virtue. You know, so it's a question of understanding, you know, that, you know, and once they realize that, it becomes important to them. And if you tell them that things like grit, resilience, and determination and motivation, these are not lacking in society to a large extent. We have a lot of these things, and sometimes they can be used for bad things. So you wouldn't say that members of the mafia lacked any of these virtues. You know, you wouldn't say that a drugs gang lacked these, you know, a criminal gang lacked these virtues. So it's not a question of, you know, the virtues, it's a question of these performance virtues. It's a question of what are they going to be used for? You know, so what's the object of these virtues? And that's why we talk about the teleological approach, where we say, when you have these virtues, what are you going to use them for? You know, because resilience is a nonsense, and so is determination if it doesn't have a social context. And if you're not promoting the common good and making a significant contribution to society, etc., in your life, then these virtues are actually can be used in negative ways. And so we try to explain that to them, that these virtues are linked to the moral, to the intellectual, and to the civic. In fact, they don't really have much of a purpose unless they promote these other three categories.
So how does this, I'm really taken by what I see as almost the social movement that you've engaged in enabling a particular perspective about education. How does it, right, like, how does that actually happen? Was this, you know, sort of a set of conversations that you engaged in? How does it start with kind of key advocates and kind of trickle down to, you know, someone in a classroom? Sort of what are the elements for you in sharing this particular perspective? Because I think the example of resilience for what is incredibly important. And there's a really critical opportunity to engage in the moral virtues and bringing the two, really the four categories all together. How did you actually do that, right, over time, right? Sort of, you described this evolution of your thought, but then also an engagement with politicians, key funders, and others. Did you imagine this in a social movement terms, or
No,
in real time?
No, I didn't imagine it like that at all. You know, and basically, I wouldn't say it was just the Jubilee Centre. I would say that we created networks and became part of networks. So we met lots of other people who were interested in promoting this idea. I think what we did was we gave a sort of academic flavor to much of what was going on. So we gave an academic credibility to some of the, and we answered some of the myths about character, that it was religious, that it was conservative, that it was totalitarian, etc. So we did lots of those things as well.
And so, so essentially you brought the academic credibility and the perspective to networks. Were those like who, right? Were those fellow educators? Were those kind of leaders of industry? Was there a combination that made this particularly effective?
I think it was just by chance. I think it was circumstance. So I think a lot of luck was involved in this, but it was also a question of saying the right things at the right time, etc.
Great. So let's talk just a little bit about the past year, which I think has caused lots of folks to reflect on their life, their work, their mission, if you will. In March 2020, you wrote a piece called Character Formation in an Age of Uncertainty, right before this year of uncertainty was unleashed. Right, has this year caused any amplification, editing of your core ideas? Is character more or less important? Is it coming together in different ways for you? Or is your thinking steady as it goes?
Both, it's both steady as we go and also advancement. So we see an increase. So the demands on us as a centre from schools and from professions has grown and continues to grow. On the international front, it continues to grow as well. So we're asked by governments to do certain things for them, which sometimes we can't do because we have about 25 members of staff who are specialists in this area now. So we've built a very solid centre and it continues to expand. And we're working with a number of universities in America as well. So we have inroads there, but we're doing it in Latin America and also in Asia and various other places as well. And we get these invitations all the time. So most of what we're doing is responding to invitations at the moment. So we've not had to go out and sort of, fly the flag. There seems to be a great demand out there.
And so, you described this as over the past year, an even greater demand. What do you think you've, in this work, have tapped into that people are experiencing acutely at this moment in the work? Why character more than ever now?
Because it's always been important. I think it's a constant. Character has always been important. And therefore, we're just tapping into what was naturally there. So we don't see it as something special. I think schools do character education, whether they think they're doing it or not. It's sometimes not so good. Sometimes it's very good. Sometimes people are not conscious that it is actually character education that they're doing. And I actually don't mind what they call it in a sense, because character education is a bit of an umbrella term that can refer to any explicit or implicit education that takes place. So it doesn't have to be, something very specific that, we are now doing character education. Although I do prefer it when people are explicit about it. Values are always clearer when you know what the values are and you can name them. Mm-hmm. And that would apply to children as well, that they can actually talk about kindness and that they understand when they, do something kind and they can describe it as well. I think that's important.
Yeah, it seems that the naming of it is important for those virtues to be habituated over time. If you don't know what you're doing, how do you then habituate it? So that kind of naming and claiming of it does seem an important dimension to what you do. So I think we're starting to queue up some questions. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to those in just a moment. You're back.
I just shut the door, there was some noise.
Okay. So the first question, much of the work around character education began in primary and secondary schools. What are some lessons from that work that translate particularly well into higher education? And are there examples of those that do not translate super well into the higher education?
Well, first of all, character education doesn't stop in school. Character education continues. It's a lifelong activity, in a sense, process. So the process of formation, as I would describe it, continues until death, really. And it's ongoing. So what children learn in school, they will bring into the employment place as well. They will bring into the university. So whatever they learn in school, they bring to the university, and they will bring into employment later on as well. So it follows them, it's part of them as they go. So universities have been concerned about character. That's always been the case. They've constantly been concerned about that, either through chaplaincy in universities or through the types of things that they do. And this has become a hugely important thing now, because the ethical dimensions of it, plagiarism, the sort of the culture, that you have in some campuses, etc. All of these things raise ethical questions, and every university has had to deal with it. But you can't just deal with it in a utilitarian way of saying, well, we'll change a policy here or have more rules and say you mustn't do this. They're talking about the people that they form, the graduates. So what is a graduate? An educated human being. So they have to be concerned about what it is to be educated. And to be educated also means that you have to have certain character traits that come with being educated. A respect for evidence, a respect for knowledge, a respect for other human beings, the moral dimension, a respect for your community and where you live, and a respect for society. And there's all these things that universities have to be hugely concerned about if they're going to make a contribution to society. I don't think a university is simply about the cognitive aspect of a human being. A university is much wider, and they often proclaim that in their mission statements. You look at some of the mission statements of universities, they're going to produce the best students possible to enter society and make a contribution. So how can they do that if they don't actually help young people see themselves in a different way and actually encourage them to make certain commitments in life? This is not done in a vacuum. Every university does this. It's just, again, like the schools, I think we've forgotten it, or we've not been able to replace the Judeo-Christian sort of, past with a clearer idea of what do we say today? That's why we used Aristotle rather than, we didn't say we're going to go back to Christian ideas. I'm in a secular university, so we went back to Aristotle. We thought, well, Aristotle wrote ethics. You can actually be a good person without religion. We accept that. And therefore, what does that mean? So, we're not using religion as the basis for what we say. We're using a tried and tested philosophy that, more and more people seem to subscribe to in terms of the virtue ethics.
So I would certainly say that, our experience here at Duke is faculty and universities are increasingly interested in this as a critical dimension of what it means to have a degree in higher education, to educate students, to be good citizens in the world. It's interesting as I reflect on the origins of the Kenan Institute, which was started before my time here 25 years ago. And I would say at that moment, there was a fundamental tension in the faculty around whether you can teach ethics, that you can promote character cultivation, and whether you should as an educator. Is it your experience that in the current moment there's more opening for that people are turning to things like Aristotle, understanding that you don't need to return to particular religious traditions to forward these ideas? Is this an idea that in your experiences within higher education, people are much more open to than say when you started or before you began this work?
I would say that, I wouldn't say that they are more open. I think that they are experiencing certain ethical challenges in higher education. And because they're experiencing ethical challenges, they're looking for solutions. Some of them are simply looking for solutions which are just rhetoric. How do we answer these challenges? We say we're concerned, we take complaints seriously, etc. Others are simply changing the goalpost. You know, if you have plagiarism, then, you know, what we say is that you can plagiarize up to 25%. If it gets really severe, we'll plagiarize up to 35%, and that will be acceptable. So others are using different devices to deal with it. So I would say that we need to understand that these ethical questions need a response, which is a response of the whole university and what the university's expectations are. So we don't see the university's expectations in a set of rules. We see the expectations of a university in terms of how young people and faculty mix with each other, how they speak to each other, how they respect each other, things like that. And it takes a particular ethos, a particular atmosphere within a university to encourage those things, to encourage that, you know, those sort of unwritten, you know, not rules that are written down, but the unwritten rules are just as important. And it takes leadership to create that type of atmosphere in a university, just like it does in a school as well.
Great. So the next question is about common reasons for resistance to teaching character. Are, one, there's no room to add anything in the curriculum, and two, we teach law, medicine, engineering, etc. What do we know about teaching character? How do you respond to that pushback at a fairly granular level?
Okay, so the best example of character education is your own example as a human being in front of the students. You know, if a student finds that you're indifferent to them, then they're not going to learn very much, whether it's engineering, law, or business. You know, they want to tutor a professor who's actually interested in them. They want a teacher who's not indifferent to them. So character education takes place all the time. It doesn't sometimes require specific interventions in a sense. It requires a good atmosphere. It requires good teachers, good lecturers. It requires people who are interested in the students, who want to see the best. They want to see their students flower and flourish and do the best and make a significant contribution, as I said, to society. And so if you want those types of things, then you have to have good teachers. And so this happens whether we are conscious of it or not. So it's the people that teach us, who train us, who encourage us, who motivate us. They're the character educators, whether you call them character educators or not.
So I absolutely love that response. And I'm recalling 2 weeks ago, Francis Su, who's written a book called Mathematics for Human Flourishing, was with us and described the teaching of mathematics and the process of mathematics as promoting virtue in just the way you describe. And so not to say we need a PhD in character to sort of stop the trains, have a seminar on character and return to regularly scheduled business. So I love that framing as something we all do. Next question from the audience. Much of the work in the cultivation of character and the virtues appears to be cast in the context of formal education and professional practice. How can character education and the virtues be cultivated in more informal settings for people who were not participating in formal education?
Well, I'm saying the workplace is a hugely important place for character education as well. You know, what types of, you know, does the workplace encourage honesty? Does it encourage integrity? Does it build integrity in the employees? So I think in any community setting, whether it be in the workplace or whether it be in the community, we would expect certain norms of relationships, certain relationships, and etc. We have to remember that virtue is always a relationship thing. It cannot be acquired in isolation. We acquire the virtues in conversation with each other, in our shared projects and the way that we go about our business, etc. This is how children acquire it. So it happens naturally. Sometimes we have to give more focus to them to be clear about what it is that we're doing. That's why I think sometimes it's good when it's explicit. But I understand that when it's implicit, when it's part of something, part of the community, it also has a great effect on people as well. So it's simply what I've tried to describe about the teacher, the lecturer being an example. This would apply to business, it would apply to occupations. People look and they see the type of people they trust, that they see the people that they, that they would want to have a conversation with. They respect the people that are worthy of that respect, etc. And they find that in the community, and they find it with your neighbor and in an employment place as well. So I would say there's a generic character development that takes place all the time in any society, in any community. And people learn from each other. And that's how we learn the virtues. And we use the virtues. We learn them and then we practice them. And we only practice them with other people. Right. So we have to be honest about something. We have to trust some person. So these virtues are always related to others. They're always looking for others. So
I think I really love that notion that they are embedded in relationships and communities. And I think this sets up the next question. How can Duke and other students teach students to be more ethical in how they treat each other? So if we have concerns about students' treatment of one another on a campus like Duke, what are strategies to address that?
Okay, so I'll take an example of, say, 3 children who are aged 3-year-olds sitting around each other, sitting in a circle, 3 of them, and they have one toy. And one of the children keeps the toy and plays with the toy and does not share the toy with the others. One thing about human nature is that we're very acutely programmed to understand unfairness. This is not fair. And the other 2 children will start crying or show, that they're uncomfortable in this situation. The teacher notices this, intervenes and say, wouldn't it be a good idea if you shared the toy? Each of you can have some experience of this toy. And they share the toy, and basically those children begin to learn the idea of justice and fairness. That's how we learn these concepts, through practice, through situations, through experience. And so universities need to go into the other extreme. You expect students who come to universities to be rational, to be autonomous in their thinking, etc. But often they're not. They're simply in formation in these areas. They've still got a long way to go. So, and though you might treat them differently, you sometimes have to provide experiences for them. And this is why a good university will have a good student movement where they provide lots of experiences for students. So students can organize most of these things by themselves. But the university must always make sure that they have experiences which help students form virtues. So it's this virtue forming approach that you can have even within a university sort of thing, and these can be incorporated into courses. So when you are sent out on a business placement, or when you're sent out to teach in a school if you're a teacher, or whether you do all these other things, these vocational parts of the university, it's important that they are not being seen to be taught ethics, because to be taught ethics sometimes is reduced to just compliance. Mm-hmm. I'll do enough to say that I've done the ethics course. The business student who says, oh yeah, I did that ethics course, tick. Doing an ethics course is one thing. Applying ethics is a completely different matter, because the ethics is basically say, I must have integrity as a professional. I have to have that integrity. What does this mean? That I have to exhibit character traits to those that I lead, those that I'm in a team with, and those that I follow that are appropriate. And these have to be things that you've sought. In other words, at some stage in life, you have to say, what sort of person do I become? What sort of commitments in life shall I take on board? Should I spend my life lying? Should I spend my life distorting facts and information? Should I spend my life not being trusted? Etc. So it's not just about teaching ethics in a formal sense. It's about practicing these things, and it's about the university providing opportunities for that practice.
Okay, great. So I love the emphasis on practice. Next question is about the concept of character and whether it differs across cultures. How can educators emphasizing character be sensitive to the diversity of cultural values?
Right. So I personally believe that human beings are the same everywhere. They have the same human nature. And this is why we're all equal in a sense with each other. We are the same species, we are the same people. Now, the cultural dimension will obviously be important. So UNICEF asked us to work with them in the former Yugoslavian republics of Montenegro and Macedonia. And we've had a project in those countries for the last 6 years, and we've sent staff there, and we've tried to work. This is with the Ministry of Education in both countries. Why were we asked to go there? Well, they had a problem in their schools that students were paying for grades. They were paying for examination results. They were actually paying the teachers money because the teachers weren't paid very much money. And so they were paying the teachers money to distort their grades. And the UNICEF thought that it was important that a project started that taught about honesty and about truthfulness and about things like this. And this is what we were trying to do. So they were actually interested in the moral virtues in that context. And so we went in and we helped the teachers to talk about this, not to take bribes, to teach these. And it's mainly because lots of the students didn't believe, because of the communist regime beforehand, many of the students thought everything should be done by the state and that there was no such thing really as society and charities and things like that. And if you wanted something, you just were as corrupt as the people that were running the country or the people that were running the businesses. So they saw the example of corruption and adopted lots of those examples. And so that's why, I would say that, getting into a situation like that to try and change a culture is important as well. And we've had some success, with the students. The students recognize that it's not a good thing, but they then say, well, but I have to do it because there's no other way I'll get into that university. Now, these are poor people. Think about in America, where rich people have done exactly the same thing. So is that a cultural thing, or is it just a cultural thing that rich people do because they think they can buy their way into universities? So the university thing in America has been a great scandal and a very, very bad example to other people around the world. And those people who did this are responsible for a really terrible example because we don't expect that in Britain, we don't expect it in America, and there should be systems in place. I think they said they were getting in by the side door, but it's still possible to get in the back door, because if you're super rich, you can still do it, but you can't do it if you've just got $30 million,
Great. So as we wrap up, I just want to ask you one final question. So clearly, right, the Jubilee Centre has been part of your extraordinary career and life's work. Where do you want to take it next as you celebrate your 10th anniversary? What's your hope for the Jubilee Centre moving forward?
Well, we've been training a new generation of people. At the moment, we have 5 professors in the centre. 2 of them are quite young, and they'll continue it. So obviously, I'm thinking of succession planning for the future. And we've employed quite a number of excellent research fellows, and we've given them permanent positions in the university because we've started teaching this idea. We have a master's course on character education, so we've appointed 3 research fellows to teach on that course permanently. So we're doing lots of things that will continue the Jubilee Centre. And it's the Jubilee Centre that holds them all together, whether they're teaching or whether they're doing research, etc. It's that common idea. And we have a very collegial way of managing. So we have weekly meetings and we're talking about all sorts of things that, you know, are important to us and in the future. So I think for us, the future is quite secure, you know, probably financially, it's quite secure, I'm sure, but also, you know, I see us continuing to do the work that we're doing. We're doing a huge amount of international work, you know. So we had a Chinese delegation who came to us recently, who said that lots of Chinese students in the West, because they have that one child policy, lots of the students, and they're very rich, these students who come to the West, and many of them are going back to China, and they weren't shown enough deference to their parents. And they thought the West, speaking of cultural influences, that they were being contaminated by the West in terms of their deference to their parents. And they wanted the Jubilee Centre to run summer schools for Chinese students to make them more deferential to their parents. We declined that. We didn't do it.
Well, this is great. I'm delighted to hear that the future is bright for you. And I just want to thank you so very much for joining us today. This was fabulous to kind of hear the history and the intellectual terrain upon which you've settled this really vibrant work and tradition. So thank you very much. And for everybody out there, next week we have Erin Seck on the pursuit of passion and inequality. So thank you very much for that. And I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.